But good heavens, man, I can't accept any responsibility. If we were all responsible for everything that happened to people that we'd had anything to do with, well, it would be very awkward, wouldn't it?
Oh, yes. Very awkward.
Guys, welcome to a classic film review of 1954's An Inspector Calls, starring Alastair Sim, Brian Forbes and Eileen Moore. Now, this British mystery crime thriller was directed by Guy Hamilton and is based on a 1945 play by J.B. Priestley. And actually, scratch that because it's not really a mystery. It's actually a study of the British class system, in particularly the snobbery and ignorance of the upper class. Actually, that makes it sound a bit stuffy, and it's really not. It features an outstanding titular performance from Alastair Sim as the police inspector sent to investigate a young girl's suicide, as well as one of British cinema's most fiendish third acts. Let's take a look. So An Inspector Calls is set in 1912 at the Birling family's large home in the industrial town of Bromley, where late one night Alastair Sim arrives to question each member of this wealthy family about a young woman named Eva Smith. Now, Eva apparently died from taking a lethal dose of poison that day in the infirmary, and as it is soon revealed, all members of the Birling clan had dealings with the deceased young woman prior to her death. And the question Sim's inspector slowly begins to pose is that, was this a suicide? Or was it murder?
Are you suggesting that one of them had something to do with this girl?
Yes.
So you didn't come here just to see me, then?
No. No, I'm afraid I'll have to ask you all a few more questions yet.
Now, as I briefly mentioned, An Inspector Calls started life as a theatre production, and its almost single-location cinematic adaptation still has that quite stagey feel, with some added flashbacks that I'll discuss in a moment or two. But for the most part, this all takes place within the Birling family residence, where one evening we find the mother and father of the family, played by Arthur Young and Olga Lindo, with their children Sheila and Eric, played by Eileen Moore and Brian Forbes, as well as Sheila's fiancé Gerald Croft, played here by Brian Worth. Now, each of these people are initially shocked or just straight up ignorant to the news of Eva Smith's death. However, as the film goes on, Sim's Inspector Poole subtly persuades each member of the family to tell his or her story about Eva. And likewise, as the film progresses, Inspector Poole's behaviour becomes quite mysterious, and at one point you may begin to suspect that Poole is not quite who he seems. And that's as much as I'll say about that facet of the story, so as not to take away from its conclusion.
I don't like your tone or the way you're conducting this inquiry. I don't propose to give you much more rope.
You needn't give me any rope, Mr. Birling.
I will say, though, that if you're a fan of murder mysteries in the vein of Hercule Poirot, Columbo, Miss Marple, etc., then this is probably for you. The culmination of many of those cases involve the detective of the tale gathering the suspects and associated parties together in a room and explaining his or her deductions. And this film is essentially an 80-minute version of that.
So if I don't choose to discuss it any further, you have no power to make me change my mind.
I'm afraid I have that power, Mrs. Birling.
No, you have not. Simply because I've done nothing wrong, and you know it.
And we will slowly learn some home truths about this family, and that their attitudes towards and treatment of this tragic young lady may have had the worst consequence. Now, Alastair Sim, who was a pillar of British acting, may deliver one of his finest roles here, my personal favourite being his portrayal of Ebenezer Scrooge in 1951's Scrooge, which was so definitive that Jim Carrey stole every moment of it for his 2009 motion capture version. But here, that silky delivery that he has manages to both charm and accuse the Birling family, coaxing information and mini confessions from the defensive group. Now, if you're not very familiar with Sim's work, do yourself a favour and track down some of his movies, certainly this one, along with Green for Danger from 1946 and School for Scoundrels from 1960. Now, like I said, this differs from the play in that we do see some actual flashbacks as each of the family members guiltily explain to Sim that they did, in fact, have encounters with the deceased. And it's great to see how clever all of their stories interlink. You have the father of the family, Mr. Birling, admitting to letting her go from his factory after she asked for a pay rise, and that months later she was dismissed from her next job after a customer complained about her attitude. The customer, it transpires, was Mrs. Birling, and so on, each one of them being a piece in the puzzle of the girl's death.
Tell me, who do you say is to blame, then?
First, the girl herself.
For letting Father and me have her chucked out of her jobs.
Secondly, I blame the young man. You ought to be dealt with very severely.
Now, When Inspector Calls isn't a long movie, and it doesn't have or really need the flash and flair of more modern movies. It obviously has the advantage of standing on the shoulders of J.B. Priestley's powerful play, a story of an upper-class Yorkshire family a couple of years before the outbreak of the First World War. Despite their lifestyle of fine dining, brandy and cigars, each is in some way damaged and will soon come to the realisation that their actions, however small they may seem to have been, can have consequences on others. Of course, there are some interesting themes at play here. The story is set in 1912 and Mr. Birling mentions the possibility of an incoming war.
Fiddlesticks, the Germans don't want war, nobody wants war. There's too much at stake these days. Everything to lose and nothing to gain.
The Great War that would signify the true end of the Edwardian era. And it's not so subtle moments. It shines a light on the selfishness and moral hypocrisy of the upper class and their attempts to be blameless in their treatment of the less fortunate.
She gave herself ridiculous airs.
She'd no ridiculous airs when I saw her last. In the infirmary. Come now, Mrs. Birling, let us have some facts. Facts, please.
Now, the film and play's genius lies in the fact that no single member of the Birling family is solely responsible for Eva's death, but together they function as a representation of a class system that exploits the neglected and vulnerable, the sum of their callousness leading to her social exclusion and despair.
But it's a pity that so often something horrible has to happen before we see some things at all. You know that not one of you is the same person that you were when I first came here tonight.
Now, the movie was made by Guy Hamilton, who will be best known for directing 4 Bond movies, Goldfinger, Diamonds Are Forever, Live and Let Die, and The Man with the Golden Gun, and also a couple of Poirot movies. Here he's only a few films into his career and shoots the vast majority of the film on stages in Shepperton Studios. Now, if I've seemed a little light on details during this review, that's of course purposeful. This is one of those films where you really have to come into it as cold as possible, not knowing a great deal, and you'll get a lot more out of it. Now, in Priestley's original play, the inspector's name was Goole. Here, of course, changed to Poole, which is a little more subtle. But Sim makes the character both enigmatic and creepy. Certainly creepy enough for us, along with the Birling family, to question not only his methods, but his actual identity.
I met a policeman I know down the road, and I asked him about the inspector. He swore there was no Inspector Poole on the force here.
By jingo! A fake!
Yes. I knew a real inspector would never have spoken to me like that.
Now, put this on for a great slice of classic British drama, but stay for the Chinese box-like twists. Think Agatha Christie meets The Twilight Zone. Go check it out.
Now, perhaps you'd like to say good night.
Not yet. I'm waiting.
Waiting? For what?
To do my duty.